Amid the bleak picture of the Middle Ages, the image of slaves working tirelessly, starving, tortured, or even killed for the pleasure of their masters has become a symbol of injustice and suffering. To gain a deeper understanding of their lives, let's follow a typical day in the life of a slave, where every moment is a struggle for survival. It is estimated that half of Rome's population were slaves, and the other half were Roman citizens. From the Roman perspective, if you were Roman, the right to own slaves was essentially part of your birthright. And if you were a wealthy Roman, you could own hundreds of slaves. During the reign of Nero, one of Rome's biggest slave-owning officials, Secundus, owned over 400 slaves at one time. He was eventually killed by one of them in 61. Ancient slaves were domestic or agricultural workers, others could become gladiators, or even worse, they could be sent to work in quarries. The master would arrange the work for the slave according to his skills, appearance, age, health, education, or ethnicity. The Romans loved Greek slaves because they were dignified, spoke Latin, and were extremely intelligent. If slaves were literate, they could live in the same house as their master and become a kind of tutor to care for and raise the master's son. But that did not mean that the master could not do cruel things to them, because slaves were not recognized as citizens and were not protected by the law. If the slave were large and strong, he would become a gatekeeper, to check anyone who might enter the master's house. If the slave were a woman, she would become a nanny to take care of her master's children because Roman mothers at that time looked down on childcare. Another job of a slave was to be a chef, preparing delicious meals every day or sumptuous meals that the master used to receive guests. Of course, if the meal was not well received, the fate of the slave serving that day would be tragic. A slave's day's work was very diverse, from plowing, harvesting, and caring for livestock, to construction and repair. For healthy slaves, they were often forced to do heavy work such as transporting stones, building castles, or mining minerals. They were always supervised by managers or supervisors. Any sign of slowness or fatigue could lead to beatings or harsh punishment. A slave's meal was often a simple meal, not nutritious enough to maintain health. The staple food was still black bread, thin porridge, dried vegetables, and rarely meat. For many people, hunger becomes an obsession throughout the day. At night, slaves would sleep on straw beds, or in the kitchen, in the attic. If the slave is an attractive girl, then being raped, sexually assaulted is a common occurrence. The worst form of slavery was probably agricultural slavery. These slaves had no personal connection with their masters. They were forced to work hard in the fields during the day and slept in chains at night. They were not treated as human beings and were forced to work themselves to death. That is why they always wanted to rebel. An equally terrible form of slavery is mining slavery. It is estimated that up to 40,000 slaves worked in the silver mines. They are not like agricultural slaves who always want to rebel, because they have no energy left at the end of the day, and just live life without knowing tomorrow. Historically, the punishments that slaves endured for misbehavior were often brutal and inhumane, intended to maintain control and deterrence. Here are some common punishments that slaves might have suffered for misbehavior. Flogging was the most common punishment. Slaves were brutally beaten with whips, often until they fainted or their bodies were seriously injured and were then starved to death. Slaves were branded with hot irons on their skin, usually on their chests or backs. This punishment not only causes pain but also leaves a permanent scar, marking them as an asset and a humiliation that follows them for life. Slaves were tied to poles and exposed to the sun for long periods, causing severe dehydration and sunburn. Or slaves could be skinned alive, an extremely barbaric form of torture and execution. In extreme cases, slaves could be publicly executed to serve as a deterrent to other slaves. Executions included hanging, crucifixion, or being thrown into an arena to be eaten by wild animals. These punishments reflect the brutality and injustice of slavery throughout history, where humans were considered property and treated no differently than animals. By the 1st century BC, Rome had become a vast empire, with wealth and power stretching from North Africa to Western Europe. However, the foundation of this prosperity was built on the blood and bones of millions of slaves, who were forced to work in harsh conditions, without rights and living in constant fear. Among these slaves, one man became a symbol of resistance and freedom: Spartacus. Born in Thrace, Spartacus was enslaved by the Roman army and sold to a gladiator school in Capua. There, he was forced to fight to the death in arenas for the entertainment of the Romans. Spartacus, although forced to fight as a gladiator, always held out hope for freedom. With his courage and intelligence, he quickly became a respected leader among the slaves and other gladiators. And Spartacus planned a daring escape. In 73 BC, Spartacus and about 70 other slaves managed to break free from their chains and escape from the gladiator school. They fled to Mount Vesuvius, where they gathered other escaped slaves from nearby areas. At first, Spartacus' group was just a small group of slaves fighting for survival. But with his leadership and fighting ability, Spartacus turned them into a powerful army. News of their escape quickly spread throughout the Roman Empire, and thousands of other slaves joined the rebellion. For 2 years, Spartacus led his slave army to victory in many battles against the Roman army, causing fear and confusion in the ranks of his opponents. Spartacus' army continuously moved throughout the regions of Italy, freeing slaves and defeating the Roman troops sent to destroy them. However, in 71 BC, Spartacus's rebellion was confronted by a powerful force led by the Roman general Crassus. In the final battle, despite their brave fight, Spartacus and his army were defeated. Spartacus is said to have died in the battle, and more than 6,000 surviving slaves were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome, as a terrible warning to anyone who would dare to challenge Roman power. Although Spartacus's rebellion was unsuccessful in overthrowing the Roman Empire, the story of his courage and desire for freedom became legendary. Spartacus, the slave who dared to stand up against an empire, forever symbolized the indomitability and desire for freedom of man. After the rebellion was suppressed, Rome realized the threat from the slave uprising. They began to worry about the possibility of another rebellion that could destroy the entire empire. To prevent this, Rome implemented a series of reforms. The new policies required slave owners to treat their slaves more fairly. Brutal measures, such as beatings and unjustified torture, were limited. Slaves who were skilled or worked hard could be rewarded more fairly. In the end, although slavery was not abolished immediately, these policies laid the groundwork for its eventual end. In 212, under the reign of Emperor Caracalla, all free Roman citizens were granted citizenship, marking a major step toward abolishing slavery. And by the 4th century, under pressure from the Christian Church and humanitarian ideas, slavery was gradually eliminated altogether.